The morning I found the note, I had already decided to quit. Not dramatically. No tearful speech, no slammed apron on the counter. Just a quiet, tired decision made somewhere between refilling the coffee station at 6 in the morning and realizing my hands had stopped shaking from the cold, only because they had gone entirely numb. I was going to finish my shift, walk home through the gray November drizzle, and write a 2-line resignation letter on the back of a receipt. That was the plan. The Hollow Spoon wasn't the kind of place that attracted important people. It sat on the edge of Dunvara's lower district, a town that existed mostly because someone, a long time ago, had needed a border settlement between the wolf territories and the human outskirts. The diner smelled permanently of burnt coffee, fried bread, and something vaguely metallic that nobody talked about. The booths were vinyl, cracked along the seams. The lighting had 2 settings, too bright and broken. I had worked there for 2 years, long enough to know every regular by their order, every creak in the floorboards, every way the front door stuck in damp weather. Long enough to stop noticing how tired I was. My name is Cora. I was 23 years old. I had $47 in my checking account, and I was, according to the hierarchy that governed every living soul in Dunvar, an Omega. The word itself wasn't an insult, technically. It was a classification. Biological, social, documented. In a world where werewolf packs structured everything from housing districts to employment access, the hierarchy was simply a fact of life, like weather. Alphas led. Betas managed. Omegas served. The system was ancient, and as I had been told many times, perfectly natural. What nobody mentioned growing up was how perfectly natural it felt to be invisible. I wore my blonde hair in a braid for work, practical, out of the way, and kept my gray cloak folded on the hook by the back door even on the coldest mornings, because it was too thick to move comfortably between the tables. My uniform was the same as everyone else's. White shirt, dark apron, name tag slightly crooked because the pin was bent. I had learned early not to draw attention to myself. Omegas who drew attention usually regretted it. The shift was slow until 9:15, when the door opened and every person in the diner stopped talking at the same time. It didn't happen gradually. One moment there was the normal low murmur of a Tuesday breakfast crowd, forks against ceramic, someone coughing near the window, the hiss of the grill, and then silence fell like a curtain dropping. Clean and complete. I was behind the counter, refilling the sugar dispensers, and I looked up because the silence was the kind that had weight. He walked in alone. Or rather, he walked in with 2 others trailing at a careful distance, broad men in dark leather, eyes scanning the room. But they may as well have been furniture. Everyone was looking at him. I had never seen the Alpha King in person. Very few people in Dunvar had. Roman Voss ruled the northern wolf territories from a fortress 3 hours east, and his visits to border towns like ours were, according to the rumors, rare and never entirely comfortable. He came when something needed to be assessed, or corrected. He was exactly what the stories suggested, and somehow still a surprise. Tall. Genuinely tall. Not in the way men sometimes seem tall when they stood straight, but architecturally tall, as if he had been built with extra space in mind. His hair fell in thick, dark braids past his shoulders, and his eyes were a shade of blue so pale they looked almost colorless in the diner's bad lighting. He wore leather and fur, practical rather than decorative, and moved with the particular stillness of someone who had never once needed to rush toward anything, because everything had always waited. He scanned the room once, briefly, and chose a corner booth. Nobody moved to seat him. I looked at my coworker Bet, who was frozen near the pie display with a cloth in her hand, and she looked back at me with an expression that said, very clearly, not me. I was the one closest to the corner booth. I was the one whose section it was. I picked up a menu I already knew he wouldn't look at and walked over. My pulse was doing something unhelpful. I focused on my feet, on the familiar path between the tables, on keeping my breathing even. I was a professional. I had handled difficult customers for 2 years. I had once diffused a situation where two beta enforcers argued over the last portion of apple crumble. I could do this. I set the menu on the table. "Good morning," I said. My voice came out steady. I was quietly proud of that. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" He looked at me, not the quick, dismissive glance I was used to, the kind that registered Omega, service staff, irrelevant, and moved on. He actually looked. A few seconds of it, direct and unhurried, and I had the unsettling sensation of being read rather than seen. "Coffee," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. It had the quality of something that didn't need to be louder to be heard. "Of course." I turned to go. "And whatever's fresh." I paused. "The rye bread is fresh. The eggs are—" "That's fine." I nodded and walked back to the counter, where Bet materialized at my elbow like a ghost. "Cora," she whispered. Her voice was barely sound. "That's him. I know. He's never come here before. Why is he here?" "I don't know, Bet." "What did he say?" "He ordered coffee and eggs." She stared at me like I had said something extraordinary. I poured the coffee and tried to ignore the fact that the entire diner was still operating at approximately 30% of its normal volume. Every conversation muted, every head carefully angled to watch without appearing to watch. I brought the coffee first, set it down without spilling it, which I considered a personal achievement. He was looking at something on the table, not a phone, not a document, just the grain of the worn wood. And he didn't acknowledge me, which was normal. Expected. I brought the food 12 minutes later. Rye toast, 2 eggs, a small pot of extra butter, because the bread at the hollow spoon had a tendency to be dry, and I had learned that the small gestures of anticipation were the ones customers rarely noticed, but always felt. He ate without speaking. His 2 companions took a table nearby and ordered nothing, which was slightly strange, but I didn't comment. I refilled his coffee once. He didn't look up. At 10:40, he pushed his plate to the edge of the table, the universal signal for cleared to remove, and I came over with the bill. I set it face down by his cup, professional habit. Turned to take the plate. He was already standing. He pulled something from inside his jacket, a single bill, set it on top of the folder, and walked out, without waiting for change. His companions followed. The door didn't even stick on his way out, which felt cosmically unfair. The diner breathed again. Sound rushed back in like water through a broken dam. Bet appeared. "What did he leave?" I picked up the bill. Looked at the amount. 0. He had left exactly the cost of the meal and nothing more. Not a cent over. I felt something deflate in my chest. Not hurt, exactly. More like confirmation of something I already knew. To men like him, people like me were just part of the scenery. I lifted the bill to slot it into the register and felt it immediately. The slight resistance, the irregularity. Something folded beneath the plate. Small. Dense. A piece of paper that had been set there deliberately, pressed flat under the ceramic weight so it wouldn't shift. I looked around the diner once. Nobody was watching me now. The excitement had moved on. I unfolded the note. The handwriting was spare and precise. The letters formed with the kind of controlled economy that suggested someone who had learned to waste nothing, not even pen strokes. It said only this: "You gave me extra butter without being asked. In 3 days, every diner in the lower district will be under pack inspection. They will be looking for reasons to close. Make sure yours isn't one of them. RV." I read it twice, then once more. The coffee station hissed behind me. Outside, the gray November drizzle had thickened into something closer to rain. Somewhere across the diner, Bet dropped a spoon and swore under her breath. My hands, I realized, had started shaking again. But this time, it had nothing to do with the cold. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the narrow mattress in my apartment above the laundromat on Carver Street and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. the one shaped vaguely like a running dog, and turned the note over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling every edge. They will be looking for reasons to close. 3 days. That was what he had written. 3 days, and the pack inspectors would move through the lower district like a slow tide, checking permits, checking compliance records, checking the invisible list of infractions that everyone in Dunvara's service class had learned to dread. An Omega-owned business, or one that employed primarily Omegas, was always easier to shut down than to fix. That was simply how it worked. The pack code allowed inspectors wide discretion in borderline cases, and borderline cases had a way of becoming violations when the inspector had already decided the outcome before walking through the door. The hollow spoon wasn't Omega-owned. It belonged to a man named Gerald, who was a low-ranked beta, and who spent most of his time at a secondary property outside town, and trusted Bet to manage the day-to-day. Gerald would survive an inspection. Gerald had the right paperwork, and the right classification, and the right last name. The rest of us might not. I thought about the 3 other Omegas on staff. Penn, who was 19 and sending half her wages back to her family in the eastern settlements. Davy, who had worked the early morning shift for 4 years, and whose hands moved through the kitchen with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something real. And Nessa, 41 years old, who had nowhere else to go, and who always remembered which customers took their tea without sugar, even when they forgot to say. I thought about them, and I got out of bed at 2 a.m, and sat at my small table with a notebook and a pen. If inspectors were coming in 3 days, I needed to understand exactly what they would look for. I knew the PAC compliance codes well enough. Omegas in service positions were required to, the same way you learned the rules of a game you hadn't chosen to play. But knowing them passively, as background knowledge, was different from knowing them the way a problem needed to be known. Precisely, specifically, with full awareness of every gap. I wrote everything down. Every regulation I could remember. Every potential infraction I had noticed and filed away over 2 years of working in that building. The back exit latch that didn't quite catch properly. The storage room where the shelving unit had been installed 6 inches too close to the wall, technically obstructing ventilation. The staff rota that hadn't been formally updated since Penn joined, which meant her hours weren't documented in the compliance ledger the way they were supposed to be. Small things. The kind of things that accumulated. By 4 a.m, I had 2 pages of notes and a headache and a plan that was barely a plan, more of an intention with some structure around it. I was going to fix what I could fix, and then I was going to tell Bet. Bet's reaction, when I arrived early the next morning and spread my notebook on the prep counter, was exactly what I had expected. "Where did you get this?" she said, reading through the list with the expression of someone finding unexpected items in a bag they thought was empty. 2 years of paying attention, I said. She looked up. Bette was in her mid-30s, beta-ranked. Practical in the way that people become practical when they have been responsible for things for a long time. She had hired me without much ceremony, and had never treated me the way some employers treated Omegas, like a liability with a name tag. I trusted her, in the careful, measured way I trusted most things. "Cora," she said slowly, "how do you know about the inspection?" I had thought about this. "The lower district's been under watch since the Kellner establishment closed last month," I said. It wasn't untrue. The closure of a diner 2 streets over had been the talk of the district for weeks. It makes sense they'd follow through. Bet studied me for a moment. Then she folded my notebook back and said, "What do we need to do?" I loved her for not asking anything else. We worked through the morning, before the first customers arrived. Davy came in early when Bet called him, and he fixed the back latch with a replacement part he'd had sitting in his toolbox for 6 months, waiting for someone to ask. Penn redocumented her own hours from memory, and I helped her format them into the ledger the way the compliance code required, then cross-referenced them against the scheduling board to make sure nothing contradicted anything else. Nessa, when she arrived for the mid-morning shift and found us all occupied with something unspoken, simply tied her apron and started checking the supply storage without being told. That was the thing about the people at the Hollow Spoon. They had all learned to read a room. By noon, we had addressed 9 of the 14 items on my list. The remaining 5 required either Gerald's signature or access to the building's official documentation, which Bet said she could retrieve from the filing cabinet in Gerald's office if he authorized it, which he would, she said, if she framed it correctly. He doesn't like surprises, she said. None of us do, I said. She called him. He authorized it. The filing cabinet yielded the last of what we needed. By the end of the second day, the Hollow Spoon was, as far as I could make it, genuinely compliant. Not performatively, actually. I had gone through every item twice. I sat in the empty diner after closing, the chairs still upturned on the tables, the smell of cleaning solution sharp in the air, and I read through my list one more time. Davi appeared from the kitchen doorway, drying his hands on a cloth. He looked at me for a moment. This quiet, steady man who had never once complained in 4 years, who made the best fried bread in the lower district, and who knew it, and never said so. You know something, he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. I know a lot of things, I said. He almost smiled. You know something specific. I looked at him. At the creases around his eyes from years of early mornings and steam from the grill. At the way he stood in the doorway like someone who had long ago decided that a threshold was enough. That he didn't need to take up more space than necessary. I know we should be ready, I said finally. He nodded once, slowly, as if that answered something larger than the question he had asked. He turned back to the kitchen. I folded my notebook closed. On the morning of the third day, they came at 8:15. 2 inspectors, both beta-ranked, in the dark gray coats that meant official pack business. They had clipboards, and they had the particular expression of people who expected to find things wrong. A kind of practiced readiness for disappointment that had nothing to do with the actual state of the room they were walking into. The taller one introduced himself as Inspector Felda. He looked around the diner with slow, methodical eyes and said nothing for a long moment. I was behind the counter. Bet was by the register. Penn and Nessa were on the floor, moving through their morning routines with deliberate, unhurried calm. Davi was in the kitchen. The breakfast crowd was modest, but real. A dozen regulars who had been here long enough to register the inspector's arrival and have the good sense to continue eating quietly. We'll need to see your compliance documentation, Inspector Felda said to Bet. She produced it without hesitation. Clean folder, organized tabs, everything dated. He went through it page by page. His colleague moved through the diner slowly, checking corners, checking the back exit, pausing at the storage room door. I watched from the counter and kept my hands still and my face neutral, and thought, without meaning to, of pale blue eyes and careful handwriting, and a note pressed flat beneath a plate. You gave me extra butter without being asked. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary, unremarkable gesture of attention. The kind of thing I had done 1,000 times without anyone noticing. Inspector Felda closed the folder. He looked at his colleague, who had finished his circuit, and returned to the front of the diner with an expression that was, unless I was reading it wrong, faintly deflated. Everything appears to be in order, Felda said. The words landed quietly, but I felt them everywhere. Bet thanked him. They left. The door stuck briefly on the way out, as it always did for everyone, and something about that felt deeply satisfying. Penn let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Nessa went back to her tables without comment, but she passed my counter on the way and touched my arm just briefly. Not quite a squeeze, not quite a pat. Something in between, warm and wordless. Davy appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me, and I looked back, and he gave one slow nod, the same as before. The same answer to the same large question. I turned back to the coffee station. My hands were completely still. That afternoon, Gerald came in for the first time in 3 weeks, ordering his usual black coffee, and sitting in his regular booth as if nothing had occurred. Bet filled him in. He listened. surprised in the way that people are surprised when something has been managed entirely without them. And then he looked across the diner at me. "Good work," he said. I nodded and refilled his cup. But after he left, I pulled the folded note from my apron pocket. I had been carrying it since the morning I found it, without fully deciding to, and read it one more time. It still said the same thing it had always said. But now, reading it in the late afternoon light with the diner quiet around me and my co-workers still here, still employed, still safe for another day, the signature at the bottom felt different than it had 3 days ago. RV, not like a distant authority issuing a quiet warning from behind a wall of power and indifference. More like someone who had sat in a corner booth and been given extra butter without being asked, and had, in his own spare and careful way, noticed. He came back on a Friday. I wasn't expecting it. I don't think anyone was. The inspectors had come and gone, the lower district had exhaled its collective breath, and life had returned to its usual rhythms. The cracked vinyl booths, the burnt coffee smell, the floorboard that sang under pressure near table 7. Everything exactly as it had been, except that now I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. Or rather, I noticed that I was watching the door. Not obsessively. Not in the way that disrupted my work or made Bet look at me sideways. Just a low background awareness, like a frequency I had tuned to without meaning to. Every time the door opened and the cold air pushed through, something in me turned slightly toward it before my brain caught up and confirmed. Not him. Just Mr. Aldrin and his newspaper. Just the 2 young beta women who always ordered chamomile and stayed for 2 hours. Just the usual. And then, on a gray Friday morning, 11 days after the inspection, the door opened and the diner went quiet again. He didn't bring his companions this time. He walked in alone, just himself, in the same leather and fur, his braids slightly damp from the rain outside, and stood for a moment near the entrance as if performing his usual assessment of the room. His eyes found me almost immediately. I don't know how to describe what that felt like without it sounding larger than it was. It was a fraction of a second, a glance that lasted no longer than any other glance, but it was direct in a way that most glances aren't, and it settled somewhere behind my sternum with a small, precise weight. He chose the same corner booth. I picked up a menu I already knew he wouldn't read, and walked over. "Good morning," I said. "Morning." He sat back, unhurried. "Coffee and the rye bread. Fresh this morning," I said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. There and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Good." I brought the coffee first, then the bread, with the butter already portioned on the side. 2 small dishes of it, because the bread was especially thick today, and one was never quite enough. I saw him register it. Just a brief downward glance, then back up. But I was watching for it because I had learned, over 2 years of this work, that the details people noticed were always more revealing than the things they said out loud. He said nothing. Neither did I. I went back to the counter. Bet appeared at my shoulder within 30 seconds. "He's back," she said, in a voice that suggested this was significant information she was generously sharing. "I can see that." "Alone this time?" "Yes." "Cora." "Beta." She made a small, frustrated sound and went back to the register. But I caught her watching the corner booth for the rest of the morning with the particular expression she got when she was assembling a theory and waiting for more evidence. He came back the following Tuesday, then again the Friday after that. Each time he sat in the corner booth. Each time he ordered the same thing: coffee, rye bread, occasionally eggs. Each time he paid exactly the cost of the meal, not a cent more or less. And each time, when I cleared the table, there was no note beneath the plate. I told myself I wasn't looking for one. On the 4th visit, I made a small mistake. I was carrying 2 plates for another table, and miscalculated the angle around the booth behind his, and my elbow caught the back of the seat with enough force to send a fork clattering to the floor directly beside his table. I crouched to retrieve it, and found, when I straightened, that he was watching me with that same quality of attention. Not the quick social scan that most people used, but something slower and more deliberate, as if he was reading something that required actual patience. "Sorry," I said, more reflex than anything. "For what?" he said. I opened my mouth and then closed it, because the honest answer, for existing in your space, for making noise, for being the kind of person who apologizes automatically for things that don't require apology, was obviously too much for a Tuesday morning in a diner. "For the noise," I said. He looked at me for one more moment. "It was a fork," he said finally. "Not a verdict." He turned back to his coffee. I stood there for approximately half a second longer than was professionally advisable, then walked to the other table and delivered the plates, and went back to the counter and stood very still for a moment while my brain processed what had just happened. Not a verdict. Such a strange thing to say. Such a precise, unexpected thing. It was Pen who first said out loud what everyone else had been circling for 2 weeks. She caught me restocking the condiment rack on a Thursday afternoon, a slow hour, low light, the diner almost empty, and leaned against the counter with her arms folded and the expression of someone who had decided a conversation was happening whether I was ready for it or not. "He always sits in your section," she said. "The corner booth is in my section," I said. "He could ask for any table. People sit where they're comfortable." "Cora." She said my name the way Bet did, with a particular weight that meant stop deflecting. "He's been here 4 times in 3 weeks. He's the Alpha King. He doesn't come to the lower district for rye bread." I aligned the salt shakers with more attention than they required. "I don't know why he comes. Don't you?" I looked at her. Pen was 23, sharp-eyed and quick, and she had a way of cutting through the careful architecture of a reasonable explanation and finding the thing underneath it that you hadn't wanted to name. "Even if," I said carefully, "there was some other reason. It doesn't change anything. He's an Alpha King. I'm an Omega Waitress. That's not a story that goes anywhere worth going." Pen was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother told me that too. About the man she loved for 15 years and never said anything to." I didn't have an answer for that. "I'm not saying anything is happening," she continued more gently. "I'm saying you're allowed to notice that something might be." She pushed off the counter and went back to her tables, and I stood with the salt shakers and thought about noticing. He came back the following Monday, and this time something was different. He looked tired. It wasn't dramatic. Roman Voss was not a man who wore exhaustion visibly, the way most people did. But I had been watching him, in my quiet sideways way, for 3 weeks now, and I could see it in the set of his shoulders, a fraction lower than usual, and in the way he sat, still controlled, still present, but with a heaviness underneath the stillness that hadn't been there before. I brought his coffee without being asked. He looked up. "I didn't order yet," he said. "You always order coffee first," I said. "And you look like you've been awake since yesterday." The words were out before I could weigh them. I felt the small, familiar clench of having said too much, the automatic bracing for correction. Remember what you are. Remember who he is. But he didn't correct me. He looked at the cup for a moment and then said, so quietly it was almost to himself. "Since the day before, actually." I set the coffee down carefully. "Do you want the bread?" "Yes." I brought it with 3 butter dishes instead of 2, because it was early, and he had been awake for more than a day, and sometimes people needed slightly more than the standard amount of something ordinary and sustaining. When I set it down, he looked at the 3 dishes, and then at me, and this time, the ghost of a smile was less of a ghost. "You're very observant," he said. "Occupational habit," I said. "No," he said, and there was something in the word that made it feel like a correction. Gentle, but specific, the way his note had been specific. "It's not habit. Habit is mechanical. What you do isn't mechanical. I stood at the edge of his table, and the diner hummed quietly around us. The grill, the low radio, the rain against the windows. And for a moment, the distance between what I was and what he was felt slightly less absolute than it usually did. "You didn't leave a note this time," I said, because apparently I had decided that the morning called for honesty. He looked at me steadily. "I didn't think you needed one." "What made you think I'd act on the first one?" "The butter," he said simply. I didn't fully understand that, but I thought about it, about what it meant that a man who commanded entire territories placed his trust in the gesture of an extra dish of butter, in the evidence of someone paying attention not because they were required to, but because they simply did. "The inspection went well," I said. "I know. My coworkers still have their jobs. I know that too. Why did you warn me?" The question came out quieter than I intended. "You didn't have to. I was nobody to you." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain thickened against the glass, and the diner was warm and amber around us, and the distance between his world and mine felt real again, but somehow also, just slightly, negotiable. "You gave me something without being asked," he said finally, "without expecting anything back. In my world, that's rarer than you'd think." He picked up his coffee cup. "Sit down," he said. I stared at him. "You've been on your feet since 6, he said. "The next customer won't arrive for at least 12 minutes. Sit down, Cora." My name in his voice was a different thing than my name anywhere else. I sat down. I sat across from the Alpha King in a cracked vinyl booth and said nothing for a moment, because I was busy recalibrating every assumption I had made about how this morning would go. The rain had settled into a steady, patient rhythm against the windows. The diner was quiet. Bet was in the back office. Penn was wiping down the far tables. Davy's movements in the kitchen were steady and distant and comfortable. Nobody was watching us. Or rather, nobody was obviously watching us, which in a place like the Hollow Spoon meant nearly the same thing. Roman had both hands around his coffee cup, elbows on the table, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me every time he came in, without the social shorthand that most people used, without the hierarchy check that Omegas learned to brace for. Just direct. Just present. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 2 years, I said. "A little over." "Before that?" "The settlement kitchens in East Dunvar. Before that, I was in school." I paused. "I know that's not an impressive biography." "I didn't ask for an impressive biography," he said. "I asked what you did." I looked at my hands on the table. They were still, which still felt like something to be grateful for around him. "Why do you keep coming back here?" "The bread is good." "The bread is ordinary," I said. Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Yes," he said. "It is. That's not why I come." The words sat between us, and I made a deliberate decision not to run from them. "Then why?" He considered this for a moment, with the same deliberate patience he seemed to bring to everything, as if he had long ago decided that rushing an answer was a form of disrespect to the question. "Because it's quiet here," he said finally. "And honest. Most places I walk into become something else the moment I arrive. This place becomes quieter, which is different." I thought about the way the diner had fallen silent on his first visit. Quieter isn't always comfortable. "No, but it's real." He set his cup down. "The people here aren't performing for me. They're just being careful. That's something I can work with." I understood that, in a way, I hadn't expected to. The distinction between performance and caution was one I had been living my whole life. "Your world must be full of performances. Entirely," he said. "No bitterness in it. Just acknowledgement, clean and flat. Council meetings, territorial negotiations, pack gatherings. Everyone in every room calculating what I want to hear and then constructing it." He looked at the window. It's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been inside it. You don't have to explain it, I said. I believe you. He looked back at me. Just like that. You haven't lied to me yet, I said. The note was true. The warning was real. You came back, which you didn't have to do. I shrugged slightly. I don't have a reason not to believe you. He was quiet, studying me again with that particular quality of attention that I was starting to recognize not as scrutiny, but as something closer to... I didn't have a word for it yet. Inventory, maybe. The careful noting of something unexpected. Most people spend the first several conversations with me trying to impress me, he said. I'm a waitress in the lower district, I said. My options for impressing you are limited to coffee temperature and butter quantity. This time the smile was real. Brief and still contained. He was not a man who gave much away, but real. I felt it like a small shift in the room's atmosphere, like the pressure change before weather turns. You're funny, he said, and he sounded almost surprised. I'm honest, I said. Sometimes it lands as funny. He came back the next week, and the week after that. And somewhere in those visits, without either of us declaring it or defining it, the conversations became the point. The coffee and the bread were still ordered, still brought, still consumed. The ritual of it mattered, I think, because it kept things ordinary on the surface, gave us both something to hold on to while the conversation moved into less ordinary territory. I learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about anyone who isn't accustomed to being asked. I learned that he had taken leadership of the Northern Territories at 26, following the death of his father, and that the transition had been neither clean nor unchallenged, that he had spent the years since then building something out of inherited chaos, and that the cost of it had been a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed something from you at every moment. I learned that he read, not ceremonially, not for the appearance of being educated, actually read, the way someone reads when a book is the only room where nobody is waiting for anything from you. He had an entire library in the fortress, and he had told me about it obliquely, describing a specific chair near a specific window, and the way the light fell on a particular afternoon. I told him things, too. About growing up Omega in a pack system that classified you before you were old enough to understand what the classification meant. About the settlement kitchens, where I had learned to work efficiently and invisibly, and where I had also learned, somewhere along the way, to notice the details that other people missed. Because invisibility, if you let it, could be its own form of access. Nobody watches the person who brings the food, I said, one rainy Wednesday. They watch each other. They have their conversations in full volume because you're essentially furniture to them. You learn a great deal that way. What have you learned about me? He asked. The question was direct enough to require a direct answer. That you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, I said. That you're careful about what you let yourself want, because in your position, wanting things has consequences. And that you came back here not just because it was quiet, but because something here... I stopped. Said it, he said quietly. Not a demand, an invitation. Because something here didn't ask anything of you, I finished, and that was enough to feel like rest. He looked at me for a long moment. The rain was steady. The diner was warm. At the far end of the room, Nessa was rolling silverware into napkins with the focused, meditative rhythm she always used for that task. You're going to be a problem, he said. But his voice had nothing of warning in it. I'm a waitress, I said. I have a 2-room apartment above a laundromat. I'm the least complicated thing in your life. That's exactly the problem, he said. The complication arrived, as complications tend to, from outside. His name was Counselor Dressed, and I had never heard of him until Bet came in one morning with the expression she reserved for information she didn't want to be carrying. Dressed was one of 3 senior counselors who governed in joint authority with the Alpha King, a structural remnant of a compromise made decades ago, when the Northern Territories had been consolidated. He was, according to Bet's source, an older man with a long memory and a habit of finding fault with anything he hadn't personally approved. And he had noticed that Roman Voss had been visiting a diner in the lower district with some regularity. "Noticed how?" I asked. "He has people who watch," Bet said. Simply, as if this required no further elaboration, which in Dunvar it didn't. The issue, Bet explained, was not the visits themselves. A king could go where he liked, technically. The issue was what Drest was saying about the visits, that it was inappropriate, that the lower district was omega-heavy and politically sensitive, that the Alpha King's presence there, repeated and informal, sent a message about hierarchy that certain members of the Pack Council found troubling, that it suggested the Alpha King was developing an attachment that was, in their terms, unsuitable. I sat with this for a long time after Bet told me. I was not naive. I had known, on some level, that the bubble of those quiet mornings had walls, that the world Roman came from had opinions about where he sat and who he talked to, and what it meant. I had chosen, consciously, not to think about those walls, because the conversations were real, and the rest of it was noise. But noise, ignored long enough, became a storm. When Roman came in that Friday, I knew as soon as he sat down that something had shifted. He ordered his coffee and his bread, and I brought them. And when I set down the butter, 3 dishes, as had become my habit, he looked at them, and then at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "You've heard," he said. "Bet told me," I said. "About Drest." He nodded once. "He wants me to stop coming here." I sat down across from him without being asked this time, something I had started doing, over the weeks, with increasing naturalness. "Are you going to?" "No," he said. The word was simple and immediate, the way his words often were when he had already decided something. "That will cause problems for you." "It will cause problems," he agreed. "For me, yes. Also possibly for this place, and for you." He looked at me directly. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend the risk doesn't exist." I appreciated that. I appreciated it the way I had come to appreciate everything about him that was plain and undecorated. The way he refused to make things easier by making them less true. "What does Drest actually want?" I asked. "Control," Roman said. "Of the narrative. Of me." A pause. "He's called a formal council review. He wants to challenge several of my recent decisions regarding the lower district protections. The inspection protocols, the compliance reforms." His eyes met mine. Reforms that, as it happens, began around the same time I started visiting this diner. The pieces settled into place with a quiet, cold clarity. Drest wasn't just targeting Roman's visits. He was targeting the decisions that had followed them. The protections extended to Omega-staffed establishments, the quiet restructuring of inspection criteria, the things that Roman had started doing, or doing differently, in the weeks since he had sat in a corner booth and been given extra butter without being asked. "He knows," I said slowly, "that the changes came from something he can't officially object to. So he's going to object to the source." Roman looked at me. "Yes, he's going to make me the problem." "He's going to try," Roman said. And there was something in the way he said it, steady and without apology, and with a weight underneath that I recognized now as the specific gravity of someone who was not going to move, that made the cold clarity warm, just slightly, at its edges. "The council review is in 9 days," he said. "I need you to understand what that might mean for you, for this place, before it happens." The rain had stopped at some point without my noticing. The diner was very quiet. I looked at the 3 butter dishes between us, small and ordinary and entirely unremarkable, and I thought about how the largest things always seem to begin with something that small. "Tell me what you need," I said. The council chamber was nothing like I had imagined. I had built it in my mind as something imposing and cold. Stone walls, high ceilings, the kind of architecture designed to remind you of your own smallness. What I found, when Roman's escort brought me through the east entrance of the territorial hall 9 days later, was a long room paneled in dark wood, lit by tall windows on one side, with a curved table at its center, where 7 people sat in high-backed chairs and watched me walk in with the particular stillness of people who had been waiting. I was wearing my gray cloak. I had braided my hair back, the way I always did for work, and I had spent approximately 40 minutes that morning telling myself that the cloak and the braid were fine, that I was not going to perform anything for this room, that the only version of me that had ever been worth anything was the plain one. Roman was already there, seated at the head of the curved table, and when I entered, he looked at me with an expression that was controlled and steady, and that communicated, in the fraction of a second before the formality of the room required him to look elsewhere, something that I held onto like a handhold on a steep surface. "You're all right. I'm here." Counselor Drest sat 2 seats to Roman's left. He was older than I had pictured, late 60s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms and had developed a physical vocabulary to match. He looked at me the way certain people looked at omegas in formal settings. Not with hostility, exactly, but with a kind of considered dismissal, the way you might look at an object that had been placed somewhere inconvenient. "This is the individual in question?" he said to Roman, as if I were not standing 8 feet away. "Her name is Cora," Roman said, evenly, without inflection, but the correction was precise. Drest's eyes moved to me briefly, then away. "We're not here to examine her personally," he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "We're here to examine the pattern of decisions that have coincided with irregular contact between the Alpha King and an Omega civilian in the lower district." He made the words irregular contact sound architectural, like a structural fault in a building. I stood near the edge of the room and kept my hands still and let him talk. He talked for a while. He was skilled at it. The kind of skill that came from long practice constructing arguments that sounded reasonable while doing something else entirely. He spoke about the importance of maintaining clear hierarchical boundaries, about the perception of favoritism in the new compliance reforms, about how the Alpha King's authority was only as strong as its distance from... And here he paused, selecting his word with visible care. Sentiment. He never looked at me directly while he said any of it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the other counselors, a woman named Irene, middle-aged and sharp-eyed, whom I had learned from Roman was one of 3 council members not aligned with Drest, looked at her papers and said nothing yet. Roman spoke. "The compliance reforms in the lower district," he said, "reduced frivolous inspection closures by 31% over the past month. 3 establishments that would have been shuttered under the previous criteria are currently operating, employing a combined 47 people." He looked at Drest. "Those are outcomes. You're asking me to evaluate the reforms by their origin rather than their results." "I'm asking you to evaluate your judgment," Drest said. "My judgment produced a 31% reduction in arbitrary closures." Roman's voice was still even. This was, I understood now, one of his forms of power. Not volume, not temperature, but this absolute steadiness, the refusal to be moved from the plane of fact. "If the council has a specific objection to the reforms themselves, I'm prepared to address it. If the objection is to where the conversation that prompted them took place, that's a different matter." Drest shifted slightly. "The Alpha King should not be conducting informal." "I had breakfast," Roman said, "in a diner, multiple times. I spoke with a member of the public who had accurate knowledge of compliance vulnerabilities in her workplace, and who had the intelligence and the initiative to address them before the inspection arrived." He paused. "She didn't ask me for anything. She didn't know who I was on the first visit. She gave me extra butter because the bread was thick and she was paying attention. That's the origin of your concern, counselor." Extra butter. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. No gasps, no visible reactions from the council members. But I felt it. the way you feel a change in the air before weather turns. Counselor Irene looked up from her papers. For the first time, she looked at me. Really looked. The way Roman looked, with attention rather than assessment. You addressed the compliance issues yourself? She said. To me, directly. Yes, I said. Before the inspection. Without being formally instructed. I had information that the inspection was coming, I said carefully. I used that time to correct what I could correct. Where did you get that information? I looked at Roman. He gave me the smallest nod, not permission exactly. More acknowledgement that this was my answer to give, not his. From a note left under a plate, I said, by someone who had noticed that I paid attention to things. Irene was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the council table and said, The Alpha King acted on an observation about character, and the observation proved accurate. The result was a more compliant, more stable business district. She set her papers down. I'm struggling to locate the institutional failure in that sequence. Drest's jaw tightened. The issue is not the outcome. Then what is the issue? Said the counselor on Irene's left, a younger man named Sorel, whose opinion I hadn't known until he spoke it aloud now. Because from where I'm sitting, the issue appears to be that someone outside our immediate circle demonstrated better judgment than our inspection protocols, and the Alpha King had the sense to recognize it. Drest said nothing. The silence had a different quality now. Not the silence of authority being held, but the silence of a position beginning to lose its ground. The formal review concluded without the outcome Drest had intended. The compliance reforms were affirmed. The lower district protections were not only upheld, but extended slightly, on Irene's motion, to cover 2 additional categories of establishment that had previously fallen outside the criteria. Sorel seconded it. The vote was 4-3. Drest left the chamber without speaking to anyone. I stood near the door as the council dispersed and tried to locate somewhere to put the feeling in my chest, which was large and complicated, and not quite any of the emotions I had words for. Roman found me there. He stood in front of me, and the formal chamber was emptying around us, and he looked at me with the same directness he had always used, but with something added to it now, something that had been careful before, held back, and was now simply present. You didn't have to come, he said. You asked me to. I gave you the choice. You could have refused. I know, I said. But the reforms mattered. Davy and Penn and Nessa, those protections matter to real people. I wasn't going to let them be unmade because I was too cautious to stand in a room and tell the truth. He looked at me for a long moment. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light was pale and clean, the kind that came after a long stretch of rain had finally ended. I told you, he said, that you were going to be a problem. You also kept coming back, I said. Yes, he said. I did. The weeks that followed were quieter, but differently quiet than before. Not the quiet of things being held at distance, but the quiet of things that had been named and were now simply real. Roman continued to come to the Hollow Spoon. Not every week. His responsibilities were what they were, and there were stretches of days where I knew, from the news that moved through Dunvar's lower district like weather, that he was dealing with territorial negotiations or council business that kept him east. But he came when he could, and when he did, he sat in the corner booth and ordered coffee and rye bread, and I brought the butter without being asked, and we talked. The conversations changed, not in quality, they had always been real, but in ease. The careful architecture of 2 people navigating an enormous distance between them relaxed, gradually, into something that felt less like navigation and more like simply being in the same place. He told me once, on a dark December morning, when the frost made the windows look like old glass, that the council chamber moment had shifted something for him. Not the outcome, but the sight of me walking in with my braid and my gray cloak and my completely unperformed steadiness and telling the truth to a room full of people who held real power over my life. I've seen trained diplomats do that less cleanly, he said. I'm not a diplomat, I said. I just don't have anything to perform." That's exactly what I said. In late January, Roman came in on a Tuesday morning and did not sit in the corner booth. He sat at the counter instead, which he had never done before, and when I turned from the coffee station and found him there, I stood still for a moment, because something about it felt declarative, in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. He was not the alpha king at the counter. He was just a man, sitting where the light was better, with his hands around a cup I hadn't yet filled. "You're in the wrong section," I said. "I'm exactly where I mean to be," he said. I filled his cup. He looked at me over the rim of it, and I looked back, and the diner was warm around us. Davy's grill, Nessa's silverware, Penn's voice somewhere in the back room doing something that made her laugh. And I thought about 2 years of invisible mornings, and $47 in a checking account, and a note pressed flat beneath a plate, and how none of those things had felt like a beginning at the time. "The Fortress library," he said. "The chair by the window I told you about." He set his cup down. "I'd like you to see it." My heart did something unhelpful. I kept my face still and my voice level. "Is that an order or an invitation?" "An invitation," he said, "without conditions and without a timeline. Something you can say no to." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm going to say yes. I did not become a queen in the story I am telling you. I want to be clear about that, because stories like mine are sometimes told that way, and this one shouldn't be. What I became was this: a woman who stayed. I stayed at the Hollow Spoon for another year, because Davy and Penn and Nessa and Bet were my people, and the work was real, and I had never believed that love required you to leave the life you had built in order to deserve it. I kept my 2-room apartment above the laundromat until the spring, when I moved, not to a fortress, but to a quieter street in the Upper District, somewhere with a window that got morning light, somewhere I had chosen for myself. Roman came to the diner less frequently as the months passed, the council work, the territorial demands, all the weight of what he carried. But he came. And when he couldn't, he wrote. Not long letters. He was not a man for length when precision would do, but specific, honest notes, the way he had always communicated, spare and real. Dressed retired from the council in the spring, citing health. Irene took a larger role. The lower district protections held. Penn saved enough to bring her younger sister to Dunvar. Davy bought the building where the Hollow Spoon had stood for 30 years, quietly, through a property arrangement that Bet helped him structure, and the diner became, officially, on paper, not just in practice, his. Nessa stayed. She said she'd stay until someone told her the tea was bad, and since nobody ever did, she was still there the last time I sat in that booth. The chair by the window in the Fortress library was exactly as Roman had described it. The light fell at an angle in the late afternoon that made the books look like they were glowing from within, and it was the quietest room I had ever been in. And the first time I sat in it, I understood completely why he had told me about it. Because some things you can only explain by showing. I sat in that chair on a March afternoon with rain against the glass and a cup of tea, and nothing I needed to perform. And Roman sat across from me reading something he didn't summarize or explain, just reading, and the room held us both without asking anything of either of us. That was the thing I had never expected to find. Not rescue, not transformation, not a story that fixed what had been broken. Just a room with enough space for 2 quiet people and their accumulated histories, and light through the window, and the unhurried feeling of having, without quite planning it, arrived somewhere true. I didn't need to be seen by everyone. I had only ever needed to be seen by someone who knew how to look. And he had learned, from a dish of extra butter on a rainy November morning, that I was worth looking at. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.